I'm the executive director of Northcentral Strong. We're comprised of a group of volunteers from throughout the community, whether it's the private sector, education, community organizations, etc. The group was formed after the events of March 2017, where there were tragically 4 people who were killed. And it probably bears noting for today's event that those events had a root in domestic violence. And so our group is committed to trying to make Wausau a better and safer place to live for everyone, all groups. By doing that through a number of different mediums, being resources for folks and also being educated. And so today is one of those events where we're trying to bring the community together and share knowledge and learn about resources and trying to advance the cause of making this a better place to live and work. Special thanks to the Chamber for helping organize this, for NTC for hosting, Community Foundation for support, and of course to our panelists for today's content. With that, I'm going to go over to the group.
We call the crinkly noises. So we heard said this is a partnership between some really great groups. So most of our panelists or their agencies are represented on the Marathon County Domestic Abuse Intervention Team. So that's who Northcentral Strong partnered up with to make sure that we were able to bring information about our community's response to domestic violence and share that information with you all and be available to ask questions, or if anything comes up in the future, you kind of have point people to reach out to. So I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves as they go. My name is Shannon. I am the Domestic Abuse Program Coordinator with the women's community. I am also fighting a round of bronchitis, so if I need a little break, that is why. So I'll kind of be navigating this today and introducing things. So a couple pieces of information and some context I wanted to share. Like Kurt said, the reason that we're here talking about this today is because we know that domestic violence can escalate to such tragedies as homicide and suicide. I will also tell you that we as a group will probably use the terms domestic violence and domestic abuse interchangeably. Domestic violence, for those of us who are more grounded in the legal world, tends to be the language that's in the laws. Domestic abuse, for those of us that are in the service and support sector, tends to be the more encompassing language that sort of incorporates a variety of tactics and emotional and psychological things too. So there are handouts on the back table by the lunches. If folks are interested, I also have some of them up in the PowerPoint if you are a forward of the classroom kind of visual person. But I have a copy of the Power and Control Wheel, which we're not going to dive into a lot, but it gives you that context of what we're talking about when we're referring to domestic violence. So what we're looking at, the basis for our response, is understanding that domestic violence is a pattern of coercive controlling behavior that one person uses to have power over their partner, right? So with that in mind, that's kind of how we look at our responses and the services that we all provide. So again, let's see if this works. Hey, look at that. So this is also on the back table, but a really great representation of that ripple effect. So starting with that couple, that partnership where domestic violence is present, but also then rippling out to children and their understanding of what a relationship looks like and impact on their classmates or schoolmates or education and development. Then rippling out beyond that to not only the service providers that are responding, but workplaces and places of education and church and neighborhood and community, and then we look even larger into the implications culturally. So to understand that this is why we chose the theme of the ripple effect, because we know it's not just a family issue, right? It impacts, and most of us know someone who has been impacted by this issue. Power and control I was talking about, so that we know that the tactics of power control take many forms. So a lot of times where we become involved is where it escalates to that physical violence or something is witnessed, right? But that's not always the case. We also know that victims tend to not report early or at all. Sometimes they'll seek support and resources that are in their own personal lives. So we may not be involved in a lot of cases. So to understand there are ways to recognize and respond even if you are not a formal system person. I think that's all I got. And you will also, I'm going to speak for the group, I'm guessing we'll probably tend to use gendered language. So we also know that domestic violence can affect anyone across ages, nationalities, ethnic backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations. But we still know that the majority of cases we're responding to, the female is the victim and the male is the perpetrator. That is probably the language you will hear us use just because we default to it, because statistically that's what we're responding to. So, no, we know, and that caveat is in place, but you'll hear us sort of default to what's familiar in our work. So like I said, this is usually seen as a family issue. But when the system becomes involved somehow, right? It's usually after a call to 911. It's usually after law enforcement is called. So I will hand, oh, she's eating. I'll talk for a little while longer. Okay.
Just took a bite because I didn't think you were, I thought you were.
The agendas. Great. Law enforcement, how slow do I need to say? I'll take a sip of water. Good? Yeah. Okay. So law enforcement is often the first interview. So with that, I'll hand it off to Sarah to talk about what law enforcement response.
My sandwich, thank you. Anyway, I'm Officer Sarah Beddish with the Wausau Police Department Victim Resource Unit. My current assignment is our Victim Resource Officer. So my primary job when it comes to working with victims of crime, generally I work with victims of sensitive crimes, so domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, intimate partner violence, which would fall outside of the domestic violence realm. My job is to follow up with them and make sure that they're supported, they reach the services they need, but also to investigate as law enforcement as well. So yes, a lot of times a victim is presented to law enforcement first. Whether the victim is the one calling themselves or a family or friend is calling, children will call. A lot of times we get anonymous reports because the family or friend of the victim knows that the victim probably isn't going to report, but that victim or family member is also afraid that they're going to lose that friendship or create issues within that relationship if they're the ones that report. Victims do report themselves. I will tell you that. However, it is a huge myth that the victim is calling us during the altercation or immediately after the altercation. It's very common, if not more common, for the victims to call us days, weeks, or months later. Same with sexual assault violence. They're afraid. They're terrified. Some of them are still in shock that something happened. Or they're still like, do I want to call and get him into trouble? Should I just let this one go? It wasn't as bad this time, so I'm not going to call this time. It's fine. Or what we see a lot too is victims will finally reach a point where they actually thought they were going to die, or the children were going to die, and now it's bad enough where they're calling it in themselves, but yet again, that could be days after. A lot of times they kind of wait for the situation to go back down again. They wait for a calm, and then they will call. So it's a huge myth that victims are calling us immediately after the fact. So law enforcement, usually we are the first responders, shocker. We will take that call for service. We'll connect with that victim. We investigate that crime. We do all of the things that you see on TV where we do an investigation. We do the interviews. We try to get the children to a forensic interview. But after that call for service, that immediate call for service where we respond on scene, It's not that it's not fixed. We basically put a Band-Aid on it because it's not just solved. It's not the end of the day. The bad guy might go to jail. The victim may be safe for a night or a couple nights, but the bad guy more than likely is going to get out of jail pretty soon. So it's not fixed. So the ripple effect is, what do we do with that victim and the children or that family after the fact? Just because officers leave doesn't mean that that victim is safe forever. Now that victim's going to have to figure out, when do I go to court? Do I have to go to court? Am I going to have to testify? What do I do tomorrow? What if he comes back? Is he going to get in the house? Who do I have to call again? I can't call the cops again, because what if they're annoyed with me that I'm calling again? I can't tell my mom. I can't tell my family. I can't tell my friends. Do I go to work? Do my kids go to school? How am I going to pay my bills? Who's going to go grocery shopping? He's the one that brought the money in. All of those things are going through the victim's mind hours and days after we have initially responded. So my job as the victim resource officer, the victim resource unit, is to step in and say, okay, this is going to suck for a while, and I'll use it because it's going to suck. It's going to be hard, but you don't have to do it alone. When a victim is left alone, that's when they're more likely to recant. They're more likely to let that offender back into their life because they feel like they don't have a choice and they feel like they have no support. The only person that's going to support them is that offender. So they may let them back into their life, and then that cycle of abuse starts over again. Our job as law enforcement is to make sure we set that victim up on the right path to prevent that recantation or to prevent them from letting that offender in. Will it happen? More than likely, yes. But we are still going to be there along the way to prevent that from happening. Once law enforcement is quote unquote done with the investigation, the VRU steps in and continues to support that victim throughout the process, and sometimes even long after the case is closed. That's where Kristen steps into play, the DA's office may step into play, but we continually support that person from day one, whatever day one is in that victim's life.
Can you talk a little bit about considerations officers are making as they're responding to an active domestic?
So as we respond, if we get a call for service and the situation is ongoing, so we are responding to an active domestic situation, whether that is just yelling and screaming, there's a physical altercation, maybe the offender physically assaulted victim, strangled the victim, sexually assaulted victim, and has fled, that's still considered active. If that offender is still somewhere in the area, that's still considered active. When we are en route to a domestic violence cases are some of the most dangerous situations for law enforcement to respond to. Officers are more likely to be shot and killed responding to a domestic violence scene than any other scene. There's also statistics that show us that offenders who have been involved in domestic violence altercations in the past are more likely to be involved in an officer-involved shooting. There's also statistics out there that if an offender has a strangulation in his past where he has strangled an intimate partner or has strangled anybody, they are also more likely to be involved in an officer-involved shooting. So when we respond to domestics, we always go two-man, if not more. We always take another with us. We generally are asking for, what's the history at this address? Have we been there before? Are there weapons involved? Are there children there? Are there pets there? We treat them as severe as like an active shooter response because it is a very, very violent scenario that we are going into. Once we arrive, we need to assess, is the scene safe? Can we approach? We have to make sure that we separate the victim and the offender. We need to get the best story. We know a victim is not going to tell us a clear and concise story if the offender is staring at her, right? It's like yelling at a child, but the child's looking at mom like, what do I say? It's the same concept. They're not going to disclose if the offender is in the same room or if they think the offender is within earshot. So we need to separate and we need to start speaking to the victim on their level. If there's injuries or trauma, we have to make sure that victim gets medical care immediately. If it's a strangulation, that is a whole different level. Strangulations can be fatal up to 3 days later, even if the victim has no markings or injuries. So if we respond to a situation where the victim was like, yeah, it wasn't so bad, but a couple nights ago he strangled me, we're going to be like, you're going to have to go to the hospital. We want to make sure you get checked out. Sometimes they don't want to, which is frustrating. But we tell them, like, strangulations can kill you. You may not realize what's going on underneath your skin or underneath the muscle tissue, but strangulations can be fatal. So it doesn't matter when that strangulation occurred, we're going to encourage some sort of medical assistance for that victim, because we know that strangulations can have long-lasting effects, especially if that victim has been strangled on a regular basis. So we want to take into consideration types of injury. And then, so after the scene is cleared, after kind of the calm has come, that's when we start our investigation of like, what happened and what can we do to keep you safe. Once the scene is safe, we'll limit it down to one officer, maybe two, but we always respond to man up.
So we'll talk more about that strangulation and those medical concerns. So we know a lot of victims, when things escalate, do have some form of injury or have experienced some form of strangulation. So one of the great resources that we have in our community and one of the great partnerships with the other agencies we have are the forensic nursing programs at both Marshfield Medical Center Weston and Aspirus Emergency Departments. So to talk to us a little more about, oh no. These are mystery guests. To talk to us a little more about the sexual assault nurse examiner or forensic nursing programs is Jackie from MMC Weston.
Hello, my name is Jackie Jankowski. I am a SANE nurse as well as an ER nurse at MMC Weston ER. So going off what Sarah said, strangulations, thank you. Strangulations are very serious when it comes to domestic abuse victims. So a lot of times they come to us with law enforcement, but sometimes they come to us on their own. And then one of the myths that we have is, do they have to call the police, or do we have to call the police if they don't want to report? And one of the myths is we have to call police because it's a violent crime. And the truth is we actually do not have to call law enforcement if they're over the age of 18. They're within their own mental capacity. So we do have some people that come in, they want to be checked out, make sure they're okay, but they don't want to report anything. Absolutely do that. We do try to encourage them to report it because we want to make sure that everything goes the way it should legally, but we can't force them to. So some of the statistics out there show that about 68% of domestic violence includes strangulation, but less than 10% actually report it. That's a huge number. And strangulation, like Sarah said, up to 3 days after, they can have, serious complications all the way up to death. Depending on the force that was used on that neck, you can get, pulmonary edema, you can get airway closure, you can get all sorts of problems. And sometimes it happens so quickly that it's too late by the time they even go to seek treatment. So as an ER nurse, when we have patients that come in saying that they've been strangled, or a lot of times they say choked, which is not the correct terminology, but if I was to say, were you strangled, a lot of them will be like, no. But then if you say, did somebody put their hands around your neck, they'll be like, well, yeah. So sometimes we have to use different wording for people to tell us what had happened. So if we know they're coming in for domestic abuse, one of the first questions we ask, did anybody put their hands around your neck? Because from a forensic nurse standpoint, I have to make sure that they're medically safe before I continue with that forensic exam. And so what that means is we're going to look at their oxygen level. We might do chest x-rays. We might do like a soft tissue x-ray. We might do an ultrasound of their carotid arteries to make sure that everything looks okay. We don't normally do, like sometimes they'll actually go in with a scope and look for petechia in the airway. So there's a lot of things to look into to make sure that the patient is medically safe. So So one of the resources that we can use is an alternative light source. So many times when people come in and they say that, yes, somebody had their hands around their neck, a lot of times you can't even see the marks. Sometimes they come a few days later. Sometimes you can only see like a little bit of redness. The alternative light source is actually a tool we use where we put them in a dark room and we use different color of lights, different color of lenses that we use, and we can actually see like bruising underneath the skin that hasn't come out yet. So a lot of times we'll take pictures of that to prove that there is damage under the skin that maybe hasn't come to the surface yet. We'll do like an evidence kit, so depending on what all has happened, sometimes we'll swab them. If sexual assault has happened as well, we can do the evidence kit on them. We're going to bandage any bleeding or anything like that. We have like the ER nurse and the SANE nurse kind of working at the same time to make sure that the patient is medically sound and mentally sound. Before we start with the forensic exam, a lot of times we call for an advocate. And so usually it's going to be from the county where the victim is coming from. If we aren't able to get an advocate from that county, a lot of times we call the women's community, and they're really good about coming and then making sure that that victim can follow up with the appropriate county. And so the advocate is a great tool to help the victim through that exam. They're there if they need a person to hold hand or just be there for them. But then that advocate knows the process after they leave our care. They can walk them through the legal process. They can walk them through like therapy and counseling afterwards. They're a great resource for that victim. So sometimes when patients come in with domestic violence, we can get tunnel vision. If they have black eyes, they're bleeding, they're missing teeth, things like that. We have to remember that we can't get tunnel vision. We do have to ask about the neck because that is life-threatening. And while the rest of them aren't the greatest to look at, many times those aren't life-threatening, but the strangulation is. And so, once we do the SANE exam, we do all the evidence collection, discharge instructions. Many times we're going to say, if you're having trouble breathing, if you're, having mental changes, your voice is changing, like your voice is hoarse, you need to come back. Because just because it's not happening right now doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the next day or two. And I think another one of the myths is, if I survived it, I'm okay. And that's not always the truth, because it can take several days for that to get to that point. And, like you said, usually it's because they lost consciousness, they lost, their urine or bowels because of the loss of consciousness, where that kind of triggers them, hey, I should probably get checked out because, well, they've strangled me before, it's never gotten to this point, and next time they probably will kill me. So sometimes it's just getting to that point. But most of the time, I think they do come through law enforcement, but sometimes they don't. They come on their own just because they want to be checked out. So
I'm going to I have one thing to talk about the strangulation. So if I'm interviewing a victim, and for example, we may have responded to just a domestic violence / battery complaint. And if I'm doing follow-up with the victim, when I do follow-up with a victim, I take an advocate with me, just so we can connect a victim with an advocate right away. And that's something we can do even if the victim chooses not to disclose their information. Advocates can speak to victims and never know their first name or who they are. So we do that. But when I'm speaking with a victim and kind of going through their history, because we know that a domestic violence incident, the rarity of it happening one time is like -0. So there's definitely some sort of history there, and there's always an escalation. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence never goes backwards. It only goes up, and it only gets more severe. So in speaking with a victim, if I ask them, have you ever been strangled? Has anyone ever impeded your breathing or kneeled on your chest or grabbed you by the neck? And they're like, yeah, like once or twice, it's no big deal. It was a couple months ago or over the years, yeah, a handful of times. But then I'll ask questions like, do you have problems sleeping? Have you had memory loss? Do you like lose your sense of date and time? Do you just feel foggy all the time? Do you get headaches? Do you see like sparkling lights? Does your vision hurt? Do your ears hurt? Does your jaw hurt? Those are signs and symptoms of repetitive strangulation over time. Because when you get strangled, your loss of oxygen and blood flow to the brain. Your brain needs that to function. So if your brain is not getting those necessary things, there's going to be side effects. So if a person doesn't want to really disclose that they've been strangled, and they may say, well, it didn't hurt. That's when I'm like, well, have you had trouble with memory? Like, do you feel like you're in a fog? Do you want to sleep all the time? Can you not sleep? Do you have headaches? And when I start to bring up those side effects, they start to recognize how serious being strangled is, or how serious that is for them, and like how detrimental that is to their life, and how it could literally have killed them or kill them in the future with other medical side effects. So sometimes asking things outside of the box and not being so direct can really get a victim to like spew out everything.
Yeah. It only takes 11 pounds of pressure on both carotid arteries for 10 seconds, and they can lose consciousness. And if it's happening over and over again, or if they're holding on to the neck for an extended period of time, 4 to 5 minutes, you have brain injury. So, you know, like you said, if it's happening all the time, the loss of memory, vision changes, memory loss, things like that, yeah, it happens pretty frequently.
And another thing I always tell victims, I mean, unfortunately, sometimes I don't say things to scare them, but sometimes we have to be the bearer of really, really bad news in order for them to kind of see the light. If a person is being strangled and they lose the ability to control their urine or bowel functions, that means that they are being strangled past the point of unconsciousness. So once they lose consciousness and they are out, they are still being strangled. That person is still actively strangling them. And then that's when they start to realize, oh, you mean I almost died? Yes, you were on the verge of death.
Yep.
For context, Jackie or Sarah, what does 11 pounds of pressure look like?
It's not much. I know, like opening up a soda is like 6 pounds of pressure. So that's just.
Imagine just lifting up a 10-pound dumbbell. They're like the size of my coffee when you think about it. Now just imagine putting that on your neck. And
really it's, 11 pounds together. So it's really like a 5 pound on each side.
You could probably lift a 5 pound with your pinky.
Oh, yeah.
So as Jackie and Sarah alluded to, the advocacy services often partner up with the responses with law enforcement or the emergency departments. We also know that victims might start with us, right? So they might contact us first, but we're working with our community partners to make sure that we're reaching victims, that we're accessible to them, and that they know that our services are confidential and potentially anonymous, but that will also help them navigate through the very overwhelming systems of criminal justice, of medical treatment and ongoing issues that might come from that, and everything else that victims are facing. So I'm going to hand it to Andrea in our legal services program to talk a little bit about some of those services we provide and how we partner with within our community.
So my name is Andrea Lasher. I'm the Legal Systems Program Coordinator at the Women's Community. And so like Shannon was saying, that's typically where we get involved, is when victims are going to law enforcement, if they come into the office, or when law enforcement calls us on scene. And so in the emergency department, when we get called, that can be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week that we can be called, and we're there for the duration of the exam or as long as the patient would want us to be there. And we're typically there to provide emotional support and just getting them connected to services and answering any immediate questions that someone may have at that point. And then in terms of law enforcement, If we don't connect on scene with a victim, we do also get contacted by all of the police agencies when domestic arrests happen, and on scene, officers are performing a LAP screen, which is a lethality assessment program screening, and that is conducted by officers at the time of the arrest with the victim, and that's a series of questions that assesses the victim's risk of lethality, and that's only used in intimate partner relationships. And so if a victim is to screen high danger at that point, it is protocol for law enforcement to call the women's community on scene, and that's our 24-hour support line. So all times of day, there's an advocate there to talk to that victim. And so we're there to kind of explain our services and just provide emotional support at that time, educate them on the power and control dynamics, reinforce the level of danger, because screening high danger does mean that they're at risk of being killed by their partner. And then we're there to safety plan with the victims and also encourage them to come into our services. And so that's why our connection with law enforcement is so important, because they're calling us to provide that service for victims, and we have a really strong connection in just getting each other connected with that victim. And so then in terms of ongoing services that we can provide for folks, safety planning, like I mentioned, so that's addressing any barriers or concerns that someone may have. So this can be in relation to kids, transportation, any important documents like birth certificates or bank information, that type of thing. Any access to weapons that the abuser might have, access to the financials, communication that they may be having with the abuser, and just kind of prepping them if things are to escalate, how to get out of that situation as safely as they can. And then we can also, like Shannon was saying, we can connect to victims at any point. So they can come into our office as well. And so even if they aren't reporting to law enforcement or they aren't getting an exam done, they can still come in, and we can also connect them to those services. So especially if strangulation has happened and it's a few days after the incident occurred and they're telling us they've experienced headaches or they have soreness in their throat or they're experiencing any type of pain, at that point we'll really encourage people to seek out medical attention because of the fact that it is so severe at that point. And I think another reason that we kind of get more appeal is because of the fact that our services are completely confidential. So they can talk to us about anything that's been going on in the relationship, previous traumas they've gone through, and none of that goes to law enforcement. We're not reporting to social services. It stays in our agency. And so in other ways that we address those barriers that clients face, that can be financial assistance, transportation, housing assistance, and we have our transitional living program, and that can help with long-term safe housing for victims. And we can also refer them to other community services, so counseling, all of the
ongoing
things.
medical care, child care, we'll
Yes.
get folks connected with a lot of agencies in town.
Yes. And so in one of those things that we can also do for immediate safety concerns for victims who have no other safe place to go, we do have our emergency shelter, which I'll turn to Shannon to kind of go more in depth about.
So part of my program is supervising our 24-hour emergency shelter. So that's the place that houses our advocates that are available 24 hours to answer the support line and to respond to the needs of the residents that we have. So we have a 10-bedroom facility that is an option for someone fleeing an unsafe situation. So they can come live with us. It's a short-term stay. We're working with them on the things that Andrea had mentioned, safety and goals and self-sufficiency, and all of those, we're really working with those residents to build their network of care, their circles of support, while they're staying with us, because going home isn't safe and they don't have another safe option. So a lot of times that looks at, because we know leaving or trying to get out of that situation can be the most dangerous time, we're taking those extra precautions for their health and safety if there was a strangulation, but also to things like just the increased risk of stalking, if someone's trying to locate their partner, if there's going to be continued contact, what that looks like in a safe way, and how can you make sure that the victim is sort of finding their voice and regaining their strength. We have 24-hour support for our residents, and we're working to make sure that as they're staying with us, we're sort of figuring out the next steps in the safest and most effective. Yeah.
Yeah, so also housed in our 24-hour support line, and so like I was saying earlier, that's a line that can be called any time of day, and there's always an advocate there to answer those calls, and that can be crisis calls, counseling, processing through trauma, and we can also provide them information and referrals for next steps of what they can do next when they're leaving that relationship. And so all of our staff are also trained and specialize in working with the legal system. So this can be criminal court, family court, civil court. And so we can assist with order filing, which is something very common to have happen right after an arrest takes place. And we can also provide court support to hearings because every victim of a case has the right to a service representative. And so that's something that we can do to make sure that they feel like their voice is heard and they're getting some justice in what's happening. And then we also have support groups, and we can also just do individual counseling and support with clients.
So the array of services we offer also, again, carries through so the forensic exam. That incident response tends to be a little more specific to an escalated situation. Advocacy sort of goes the duration, right? So we're there for as long as a victim wants us to engage with them, and in multiple capacities. So we've given rides, people have come and stayed with us, we've done the paperwork for things. One of the main places that especially Andrea, but all of our staff end up navigating with victims is through that criminal process. Because there's a lot of pieces and moving parts and changing components that go with that. So one of the more frequent places that we show up is in the courthouse. So she knows it's coming. Pass it off to Elizabeth to talk about the prosecution.
Yeah, hi, I'm Elizabeth Gabert. I'm an assistant district attorney here in Marathon County. I've been a prosecutor for 14 years and all over the state of Wisconsin, and what I can say is that domestic violence, domestic abuse is occurring every single place, whether it's in large cities, tiny towns, places that aren't even incorporated. I was the DA in Langlade County, 19,000 people in a gigantic geographical area. Tons of domestic abuse going on, and really, really frustrating resources. So I'm starting out by telling you that Marathon County is very blessed when it comes to the services that are available and the supports that are available for victims as they try to keep themselves safe, however that looks for them. So as the prosecutor, it's my responsibility to review the police reports to determine if criminal charges should be filed, to determine if there should be further investigation, basically to do everything I can to build what is going to be a very strong case, whether it is for negotiating with the defense to persuade them that this defendant certainly doesn't want a trial, or if they insist on a trial, I'm happy to do that and provide that service as well to make sure that they get held responsible for their actions. So on TV and in movies, a lot of the time you hear about victims pressing charges. In the state of Wisconsin, that is not actually a thing. You don't get to decide if you want to press charges when it comes to domestic abuse. And on the one hand, I think I can see how people would say that is taking the power away from the victims, and the victims are already so beaten down and manipulated by their abuser that isn't the court process just doing that too, saying that the victim doesn't have the power to make that decision. But the other side of the coin, which is I think how it plays out in reality, is a lot of the victim says, oh my gosh, it wasn't me. I didn't have to say that I was the one who wanted the state to do something. I didn't make that decision. I couldn't make that decision. And so when my abuser is saying to me, drop the charges, it's very simple. I can't drop the charges. I'm the victim. I can't drop the charges. That B in the DA's office is saying she's not going to drop the charges because she's such a jerk and da-da-da, whatever. Great. Keep the victim safe. and prevent the perpetrator from being able to say, I'm going to do everything I can to get this woman not to go through with the case, right? So it's the state's responsibility to prosecute these incidents, and really, as a society, we all have an interest in keeping victims safe. We all have an interest in just our communities being good, safe places. And the theme of this presentation, the ripple effect, is where I think we come in to say we all have an interest in these intimate partner relationships not involving domestic abuse, because of all of the different ways that these incidents, that these toxic relationships impact our communities. So, I reviewed the referral. Like I said, I'll sometimes ask for additional information. I'll ask them to interview family members or children. We have a child advocacy center where we have children submit to forensic interviews to get a statement from children, what they've witnessed in an incident, and do what we can, like I said, to just build a really strong case so that if we have to go to trial, that we will prevail in the jury trial. So in that process, like I said, a lot of the time you get the victims who say, oh my goodness, thank you so much for everything you're doing. Thank you for fighting so hard for me. Doing what they can to stay safe in their home, and appreciating what the state is doing. But then there are times where, of course, we have victims who, because they are maintaining that relationship with their abuser, or like Sarah was saying in her comments, thinking about all of these other things that are going on in their lives. I can't tell you the number of victims I've had who are serious medical limitations, right? Like, I'm in a wheelchair, my kids have to get to school, like, I need somebody physically helping me in the house with my kids, right? Like, what would you do? Putting yourself in that person's position, what would you do? If your abuser is also your care provider, right? And so there are times where victims will, for one reason or another, recant, and the court process is actually not a bad place for recantations. The law is pretty good for being able to use statements that they've previously made, and then and having a domestic abuse expert testify about recantation. So we can still proceed with the case even if they recant. If they become uncooperative, there are still ways that we can proceed with the court process. So if they disappear, we could, I would not do this, but we could ask the court to issue a warrant for the victim's arrest if they failed to appear for after receiving a subpoena. We can also argue, there are other ways we can argue. I won't get super legal, but there are other ways that we can argue about how we should still be able to continue even if the victim is no longer willing to cooperate with the court process. Because you may be thinking, well, right, but if the victim is saying they're good and they don't want this anymore, why would you keep on going? But the reality is, we see, I've prosecuted offenders who have 3 or 4. I can go on CCAP and I can just look at their entire history. Here are their criminal convictions between 1997 and 1999. Oh, and they're in 2000. There's their 20 FA case where they got a divorce from that victim. And then a few years pass, and then, starts in 2004, criminal convictions, 2005, criminal convictions, 6, 7, 8, 2009, FA case with another divorce, right? And you can see that they're just because they're getting divorced or they're ending the relationship or whatever the case may be, that doesn't mean that the abuse is ending. It just means that they'll have a new victim, looking at it as cynically as possible. So we have an interest in continuing to prosecute those people because, again, we want our society to be safe. And even looking at CCAP, the Wisconsin Circuit Court Access Program. There we go, for normal people. But looking at that program online, perpetrators are often smooth talkers. They're often very charming and sweet and whatever, especially during that courting phase before they have to get into the relationship and deal with all of the guts of being in a long-term relationship, which can drive a normal person crazy. But, you know, they can say, oh, no. You see, I was married to this lady and she had all these mental health problems. And so that was what those old convictions were from my first marriage. And then this other lady, well, if you look her up on CCAP, you'll see she has her own record too. So that's why I have all of those convictions with that lady. They'll find a way to explain it away, minimize what they did so that they can continue to have relationships. And that's why it's very important for the criminal justice system to intervene to rehabilitate those people if it's possible to rehabilitate them, because we hope it's possible to rehabilitate offenders, or if it's not, then to just remove them from the population for longer periods of time. So to that end, when you're talking about somebody who has this cyclical history of domestic abuse, there is a provision in the Wisconsin laws that specifically in regards to domestic abuse, that there's an enhancer that was created. I think it was only created maybe 6 or 7 years ago, that is an enhancer for a person if you have 2 prior convictions that involved the domestic abuse enhancer. So if it was charged as a domestic abuse incident and you got convicted of at least 2 counts of that, and it was in the last 5 years, then anything that you get charged with domestic abuse-wise can be charged as what is called a domestic abuse repeater, and that makes that turns misdemeanors into felonies. It turns the felony classification from a lower felony to a higher felony, so it increases the penalties. And I think historically that's because we were seeing just a person who has 30 prior misdemeanor domestic abuse convictions, but they were all disorderly conduct, which is a maximum penalty of 90 days in jail misdemeanor. Battery, which is 9 months of jail misdemeanor. And so the legislature was really smart in creating this enhancer that now makes it so on those disorderly conduct, domestic abuse as a domestic abuse repeater, you can go to prison for up to 2 years. When without the repeater, it would be 90 days of jail. So that was a big step forward for protecting victims in Wisconsin. And then you have the standard repeater that I don't need to talk too much about, but that's just if they have 3 prior misdemeanor convictions or 1 prior felony conviction in the last 5 years of any variety. And so that repeater can also be applied even if they don't have a prior domestic abuse history, if they have, like I said, 1 prior felony or 3 prior misdemeanors in 5 years. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about was bond and violations of bond, because this is a very serious issue going on in Marathon County right now. If I can be blunt, we're struggling with this, with bond and bond conditions. So when a person gets charged with an offense and they're in jail for their initial appearance, or they get a summons and they come into court voluntarily for their initial appearance, part of the initial appearance includes the court setting bond. And so you can either have a signature bond or a cash bond. Some weird places do a property bond where you can offer to put up your house or something. We don't do that I've never done that any place that I've worked, because that's really weird. I don't think we'd necessarily take a person's house if they violated bond, but anyway, so it'd be kind of crazy, right? Their car, a boat, snowmobile. Anyway, so you get ordered to a bond. Signature bond or cash bond are generally the 2 options. And then there are standard conditions. You promise you're going to come back for court. You promise you're not going to commit any new crimes, right? So sign that form. I'm not going to commit any new crimes. And then there can also be specific conditions of bond. The biggest one being no contact with the victim. And so that's where the manipulation, that's where the abuse really still continues, because it's like I tell victims all the time, I try not to I try not to sugarcoat anything, so I say bond is just a piece of paper once the person has either posted the cash, if there's a cash component, or signed on that line to be released and not taken into custody or kept in custody. That's a piece of paper, and that's what it is. And it's not like there's somebody who's going to follow them around all the time to make sure that they're complying with bond. And so this is where we still see the pressure and the intimidation going to the power and control wheel, right? Use of coercion and threats, right? Is the abusers trying to get the victims to modify that no contact to allow them to have contact, the perpetrator to have contact with the victim. For my entire career, I've told victims, you don't have to make that decision because I'm the prosecutor. I'm here to make a recommendation that is in the public's interest, but also in your interest when it comes to public safety and your safety. And so I'm going to request the no contact. And if the court orders it, I'm going to object if the defense wants to get that no contact modified. Now, the kind of the kink in our current system here is that if the defense files a motion to modify the bond, the victim has the right under the Wisconsin Constitution and Chapter 950 of the Wisconsin statutes to make statements that impact their interests. And so the victim has the right to tell the court input on the bond. And so now we're back to the perpetrator secretly violating their bond and talking to the victim and saying all of those sweet, nice things that they said when they were first dating, saying, come on, honey, I love you so much. You know it's never going to happen again. I quit drinking, or, I quit doing drugs, or whatever the case may be. I broke up with my girlfriend, whatever. So please take me back. I want you back. I want to help you with the bills. I want to help you with the kids. And then suddenly the victims are getting pressured to ask the courts to lift the no contacts. And then I go in and argue, this case involves aggravating factors. I'm concerned that this person the perpetrator might kill this victim, but then it's up to the judge if they're going to modify the bond or not. And like I said, it brings that manipulation right back into the process. So on that really, really just truly drab note, that's basically the court process.
Now I get to piggyback off of that again. As bond conditions are just a thorn in my side as law enforcement goes. So a lot of individuals, the normal people as we call them, have no idea how the process works. So if we take a Demuse, wow, it's technically
You've just combined it like it's shorthand now.
It's technically my Monday. Still, I was on a motorcycle in the storm yesterday, so I'm still drying off. It's been a day. Anyway, so when we take a domestic abuse offender into custody, which means, so in Wisconsin, state law mandates that if law enforcement finds probable cause that a domestic violence crime occurred, we are mandated to make an arrest. We have to make an arrest or do our best to locate that individual to take them into custody. We cannot just refer a charge over. If we have spoken to the offender and we're like, oh, naughty you, but I get it, I'll just refer you. If we are in contact and there's probable cause, by law, we have to make an arrest. Additionally, say for example, we respond to a domestic violence scene where husband and wife, they were fighting too loud, the neighbors called. We have no history there. We have no reason to believe that it's going to amount to anything further. No indication that there's any fear. It was simply an argument like we all have. We are still mandated to do a report and send it to the DA's office because that's how serious Wisconsin takes domestic violence law. So if I take somebody into custody for a domestic violence offense, once they're in custody, a 72-hour no contact automatically goes into place. So that means that that offender cannot have any physical contact with the victim or indirect contact with the victim. So that covers the offender while they're still in jail awaiting their initial appearance. The crappy thing about bond conditions that an offender gets when they go to initial appearances, it does not cover them if they are still in custody. So for example, if they go to their initial appearance and they get a cash bond and they can't post that cash, they have to stay in custody. So they might get a bond condition that says no contact with their victim. That bond does not cover them while they're still in custody. So they can call their victim all day long if they want to from the jail, because that bond does not go into place until that victim is released. We just had a case like that last week, and we had to issue a protective order because not only was the offender violating the 72-hour contact from jail, he then violated after the 72-hour contact lifted, so he was calling her from the jail, so we shut his phone off. He was having other inmates, but we had nothing preventing him from doing that because the bond has not gone into place yet. So we had to issue a protective order. So the 72-hour no contact will cover the offender while he's still in custody. So that means he can't call her from the jail, he can't have his mom call her, he can't have his best friend call her, any of that jazz. The victim has a right to go to the jail and waive that 72-hour no contact, just like they have a right to go and request modification of a bond condition from initial appearance. The reason we put a 72-hour no contact into place is because we know that the victim is at most risk for continued violence or lethality after they have notified law enforcement and after that person has been arrested. The 72 hours is literally given to a victim to allow them time to safety plan, to seek medical services, to flee, to find a safe place to go, to continue talking to law enforcement, and a chance to just breathe, to change their locks, to get a new phone number, to do whatever they need to do to keep themselves safe. But yet we allow them to waive that 72-hour no contact if they wish to do so. Also, I found out the fun fact of 72-hour no contacts is a 72-hour no contact only goes into effect on domestic violence cases. That is the only crime where this 72-hour no contact is issued. It does not go into place with any other intimate partner crime or sexual assault, stalking, nothing. Only DV cases. If it's a domestic violence stalking case, so if it's a husband stalking a wife, that would technically have a domestic enhancer. So a 72-hour would go in there. But if we have a stranger stalking case, 72-hour does not apply. If an offender violates that, so he gets out, he posts his cash bond to get out of jail. If he violates, if a person is taken into custody on a domestic violence charge and it's a misdemeanor, they can post a cash bond to get released from custody. If they can't post that cash, they have to sit to see the judge, whether that's the next day or on Monday or whatever the following business day is. If it's a felony, so say there was a strangulation component, they have to sit to see the judge. They cannot post cash to get out early. They have to see the judge for a felony charge. So if they post cash, a very common is DC and battery. That would be a total of $650 cash. They have to post if they want to get out of jail without seeing a judge, because those are both misdemeanors. 72-hour no contact is still in effect. If they violate that 72-hour no contact, it is a mandated arrest. We have to make contact. We have to take into custody. It's a misdemeanor offense. Do you think they have to post cash again to get out, or do you think they get to sign a signature bond? They get to sign a signature bond. They get to sign on the dotted line and say, oopsies, I'm sorry, but I promise not to commit any more crimes while this case is open. So they get to sign a signature bond and get out of custody and potentially continue to reoffend. Same thing if they violate a bond condition that the court has set into place. Highly unlikely that they are going to be given a cash bond if they violate a bond condition that has been set into place. Our system is backwards. And I'm off my high horse now. So I have issues with the bond condition. And I'm off my high horse now.
One thing that comes to mind just in the two of you talking about it, because I know we were strategizing over here. I know one thing, as you were talking, Elizabeth, about like that manipulation and the minimization. One of the things that we know abusers will say is that I don't have a history of domestic abuse charges. Can you talk about how it looks if I CCAP someone's history? Because it's not like on TV where it'll say domestic violence. Can you talk about how that charging looks in Wisconsin?
Oh, sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, okay. So in Wisconsin, in order for it to be domestic abuse, there's a definition, and you have to meet the definition of, generally it will be like a domestic relationship is the issue, where they are not, so in order for it to be domestic abuse, they have to be married to each other or have been married to each other in the past. They have to, or have a child in common.
Two adults that have previously lived together but are not married.
Right, yeah, right.
So think of like brothers.
But what happens is you have, so the one that truly breaks my heart is the young woman who is pregnant with this abuser's baby, but they have never been married and they've never lived together. Even though she is pregnant with his baby right now, and obviously they're in a dating relationship, they don't qualify, that does not qualify as a domestic abuse incident.
Just because the baby hasn't been born?
Right.
Correct. It doesn't qualify as a child in common.
Yeah.
But it could qualify depending on injuries. Depending on the severity of injuries, there could be the chance, like
right, still not as domestic.
So it changes the
And so, like, so you have to meet the statutory definition of a domestic relationship in order for the law to define it as domestic abuse. So when you look at a person's CCAP record, you'll see maybe that they've been convicted of disorderly conduct.
Or battery.
And it just says disorderly conduct, it just says battery, and then they'll give you a story. Oh, I was in a bar, and this guy was being rough with this woman, and so I stepped in to protect her, and I got into a fight with that guy, and so we both got convicted of DC for that, disorderly conduct for that, right? They'll make up a story, and you won't be able to tell from the public records that it was actually him beating up his own girlfriend, right? Or being physical with his own girlfriend in a bar, right?
Because with CCAP, with Wisconsin CCAP, the victims are always labeled with initials. So you may not...
That's county by county.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So Marathon County, sorry.
In Marathon County, it's initials.
Initials, so you may not know that it was an intimate partner.
Was that the direction you were
Yeah, so I mean, I think the other thing that where Wisconsin is a little bit different is that domestic is an enhancer, not a standalone charge. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So right, but the enhancer would always be if it got so So if the person got convicted of disorderly conduct, domestic abuse, then it will show up as disorderly conduct, domestic abuse, and CCAP. But the one way it won't show up is it got charged that way, but this person loves hunting. And they say, oh, I'll take any conviction you want. I'll do probation. I'll sit in jail. But I don't want to lose my right to possess a firearm because I love hunting. So drop the domestic abuse enhancer, and I'll plead. I'll do the maximum amount of the maximum penalty you want me to do, but please don't take away on my ability to hunt because we're in Wisconsin. So what's really fun is when somebody says that, they tell their defense attorney that, their attorney tells me, I say, okay, I'm going to look into this, I'll let you know, and then I'll have a meeting with the victim and I'll say, does he hunt? No. Oh, well, that's very interesting. So I'm untrusting of everybody. No, I'm kidding. I trust them. But in my job, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna see like where, like, is this you just saying what you want to say so that you can continue to possess firearms? You know, because we all can understand why it would be bad for people who have issues with domestic abuse to have access to firearms.
So another thing kind of with that, a couple years ago, we had a really, really, really terrible stalking case. It was domestic related. They were intimate partners. They had resided together. Terrible, terrible, terrible stalking case. Yeah, terrible. At the end of it, he ended up pleading guilty to, was it domestic battery and several counts of felony bail jumping? Because in the state of Wisconsin, felony bail jumping actually holds higher weight than a stalking charge. Stalking is a felony, but bail jumping is a higher felony. And so he pled to the bail jumping because he didn't want stalking on CCAP.
I think she got one in.
No, she didn't. No, it was all bail jumping.
So do they get the right to secure the plea deal, or can you say tough?
So the victims have input. The victims have input, and they ultimately agreed to it because our concern with.
But so I'll maybe fill that
Yeah.
because it's complicated.
It
so
is.
the victim has the right to give input, but they can't accept or reject
No.
the state's offer. The prosecutor makes the offer, and I always tell victims I absolutely am taking your input into consideration. Your input is important to me, and I want to know all of these details that you're willing to share with me. But also, I have other objectives that I also have to consider, like the general public safety. And so I've somehow developed a reputation for being really tough, and I don't know why that happened, but even my stepdaughters are afraid of me. It's true, they are, but anyway, so so the victim has the right to give their input, and I take it into consideration. Here's where I think the crux of your question comes in, and that is that nobody can stop the defendant from changing their plea to guilty, and nobody can. So the defendant has a lot of power to do a lot of manipulations, like they would want to do with this, group of people. They have the right. They have a lot of power within the criminal justice system. We can't make them. The state can't make the defendant accept an offer. If they, like I said, if they want to have a trial, we're going to go to trial. But also, what's really messed up that really bothers me is that the defendant can say, "I'm just going to plead guilty, and you can argue whatever you want, and my attorney will argue whatever they want." And you would think, wow, well, that's really great, because Elizabeth's going to go in there and be like, "Judge, look at this history, look at all of these factors. This is a dangerous and scary human being." And then this defendant is going to come in wearing his nicest suit, fresh haircut, clean shaven face, walk in, sit down, very polite, and just look really remorseful. And make their arguments about how this isn't a bad guy. Look at him. He's not dangerous. Look at this guy. He's so appropriate in court. And then the judge may say, and then it really is entirely up to the judge, because we don't have an agreement. They can do the minimum, which would be only court costs, all the way up to the maximum, which is, how much incarceration is allowable based on the charges. So when that happens, that's actually my worst nightmare, because then that means that the judge, it's 100% the judge, their perceptions, their biases, their experience, their history themselves. I appeared in front of a judge who told me, always would tell, not just me, always in a domestic abuse sentencing would always talk about an incident where he was in an argument with his ex-wife, and they were arguing about something, and he was doing the dishes. And I was like, well, right there, that's not domestic abuse. No, again, just lightening the mood here. He's doing the dishes. That's great. But he said he was doing the dishes. They were having an argument, and he had a glass in his hand that he was drying, and he turned around, and he threw the glass into the sink, and it shattered. And he said, "I am guilty of domestic abuse because I lost my temper and I broke a glass in the sink. I somehow understand domestic abuse because I am a perpetrator." And so, that's what's scary, is that you don't know what the judge is going to do. And because they really can do with domestic abuse. the only offense that would have a mandatory minimum sentence would be first-degree intentional homicide. Otherwise, everything else is 100% discretionary.
And then, so
Gosh, I keep on ending on just
Well,
like
and
a
like,
really
just
okay.
in the interest of time, though, we can come back to this if we need to, but we still have our treatment part of it and our family law part of it. And I really want to get into that.
I will keep my mouth shut.
Because we could talk about the laws for like 3 days. So, so I think after this initial, incident or crisis sort of moment, the other thing that we understand is that impact on mental health and healing of the victim carries on. So part of our response in the community is also providing that support. So I'm going to hand it to Kristen to talk about mental health.
We got 20 minutes?
We got 20 minutes, but also Carla and Megan too. So.
Sorry, Megan. Okay, I'll be super quick. So my name's Kristen Seidler. I am a therapist. I work at the Wausau Police Department with the Victim Resource Unit. And so my job, I'm employed through a VOCA grant, a Victims of Crime Act grant. And so through that, I'm able to see victims of crime for free and provide them with free therapy. And so that can be a reported crime or a not reported crime, which is pretty cool. So I end up going to like the women's community. I see kids at schools, kind of all over the place for things. And so, sorry, I'm trying to think about like how I really want to go about this. So there's lots of things that can be taken into consideration as far as the mental health stuff. Just some, because I know this is kind of about myths. Some misconceptions or misunderstandings I think lots of people have as far as trauma goes is that when something bad happens to us, it must like really stick in our minds and we're going to remember it super, super clearly because it was such a horrible thing. And I am here to tell you that is not at all true. That's just not the way that it works. That would be super cool if it was, because I think there would be a lot more convictions and different things that would go on, but that's just not how it works. When something really bad happens to us, our brain kind of gets flooded with a bunch of stress hormones and chemicals, and that kind of messes with how all of our memories get stored in a super simplified kind of version of that. And so therefore people don't tend to remember things, number one, in order of how it happened. A lot of times they'll just remember like fragments of things. They can't really remember when it happened. A lot of times they won't be able to put words to things, and sometimes it's a lot more sensory actually, where like if you bring up, oh, like you were, sitting on this chair, like how did the chair feel? And that might spark some things for people. Like it's a very odd thing, and for people who haven't been through that, it seems really weird, and so that's where a lot of times people's credibility gets called into question, and honestly, that's just how the brain and trauma work, and so they won't remember anything. You feel like you're going crazy, and that's where lots of times too people will come like days later and be like, oh, I remembered this, or oh no, this happened, like I said it was this, but it actually like I remember, like this just came to me. It actually happened like when this took place. And that, I'm telling you, is totally common, and that's kind of just how trauma works. So a lot of times it looks like people are lying, and they're really not. And that happens with like domestic violence. I know we're not talking about sexual assault, but that happens with sexual assault a lot as well. And I think people are a lot less understanding of it happening with the sexual assault. I think we're more understanding with the domestic violence because we kind of already in our heads know that it's like happened multiple times. So we have a little bit more grace with people for not remembering certain things or getting confused. But with sexual assault, we tend to really hone in on that you must be lying thing, and that I'm just here to tell you that's not true. So if you hear that, please try and educate people. So what I work with victims a lot on is educating them on that as well, because they kind of feel like they're going crazy, and there's been so much manipulation that's been going on a lot of times for years. That they are just automatically questioning themselves all the time and like, well, maybe that really wasn't how it was, or maybe it was just because I, pissed them off or whatever else that it might be. So a lot of the things that I do are educating them on kind of on the brain and like, nope, the way that you're responding, you're not crazy. This is just like how your brain responds to things, and going through some different coping skills for some of that. And then and there's lots of different ways to kind of go through that. I could spend like 3 hours talking about all that stuff, but I won't. And so helping them through the court system, all of those types of things, because like they just said, the court system is a long one. one thing, and I know Shannon had mentioned it to me, a lot of times couples counseling, and Carla, you drive in too with this, because I'm sure I'll have good, but couples counseling comes up a lot, like where people a lot of times get suggested to go to couples counseling, and that's just gonna fix things in like an abusive relationship. I tend to say that that's a big no-no.
Absolutely no. Absolutely no.
Couples counseling is not conducive to an abusive relationship. I know people suggest it with the best of intentions, and honestly, that is really where a lot of the power and control stuff can really get exerted over a victim, is in couples counseling, especially if the counselor isn't well versed in domestic violence, which unfortunately a lot aren't. That's not something that gets not a lot of curriculum is on, at least not when I was in grad school. We had like a little chapter on it. I mean, it was nothing. So, anyways, I'm not going to go on my soapbox about that. But so that can really be a good place for, like I said, the abuser to exert a lot of that power and control, because the victim isn't going to speak up about things, and it just ends up being a place where the abuser can kind of pound into them more, like, well, they don't do this or they don't do that. And a lot of times, like I said, the counselor unknowingly, because they just don't have enough knowledge on those things, kind of feeds into that. And it just ends up being another entity that is exerting that power and control and making the victim feel more powerless, more helpless, more hopeless. And it can
Possibly even at fault.
Yes, at fault. That's where a lot of the gaslighting and stuff will continue as well. So I always suggest to the people that I meet to not do couples therapy. I was like, nope, if you guys really want to work on your relationship, which I'm not here to judge, like if you want to do that, that's, for you. You see your therapist, and they need to see their own therapist and actually like take accountability, do their stuff, maybe do the SAFE program that Carl will talk about. Because maybe then, if like you're each doing your own work, and then maybe that can get talked about long way down in the future. But was that kind of what you wanted to?
Yeah, I think that's great. And
Okay.
was it important?
Yes. Okay.
As we talk about that communication part.
Okay. I can turn it over. So.
So I think as we're kind of looking down the road after that initial incident, one of the things that often comes up for the team and for our victims and their families is the family court process and what that looks like. So I am going to hand it over to Megan from Judicare to talk about family court.
Hi, I'm Megan. It says Communications and Development Director, but I'm an attorney. I practiced primarily in family law and victims' rights work, so representing victims of sexual assault and domestic violence was all I've done. So a lot of that work, or whenever I'm working with a victim of domestic violence, and I always tell people that I use the word victim because that's the legal term, but if my clients wanted me to use a different term in referring to them or talking about them, I'm happy to adjust that. Oh yeah, a little bit about us, yay me. But yeah, my email's there too if you have questions, but really, making sure that when we're working with a victim of crime, and especially a victim of domestic violence, that we are empowering them as much as possible to have as much control in the situation as they can, be the one making the decisions. As their attorney, I always tell them that I am here to kind of help you through this process, to focus on like the legal aspect of things and to do the complicated parts and to really talk you through what your options are, what would happen if we did get a restraining order, if you did file a police report, like what that could look like, and if you don't, what that could also look like. So making them informed as possible so that they can make decisions for themselves and really drive their own kind of future, because I think a lot of domestic violence is about taking that power away and really kind of making them feel small. So really part of my goal as being an attorney who represents victims is to try to give them as much power back as possible and let them own that. But the reality of our legal system is that attorneys who take on like the guardian ad litem role in family cases, judges or commissioners who are overseeing and making decisions about orders in family cases, they have varying understandings of what domestic violence looks like. Some of them are still stuck in the mindset of domestic violence is a physical attack and that's it. Like that's what domestic violence looks like. Everything else just isn't real. Some judges or other system partners do have a better understanding that domestic violence can be that power control wheel, can involve that manipulation, cutting them off from family, isolating them. So when you're faced with that kind of varying understanding of what domestic violence looks like in real life, it can be very hard as an attorney to help communicate to a victim client that the reality is that documentation is going to be where we're most successful, because there are like statutes that say that if there's domestic violence, the presumption shifts from like joint decision-making power between the parents to sole decision-making power with the victim, rather than the abuser having to be involved in that at all. But courts often are looking to restraining orders, police reports, criminal charges, to be able to say that, oh yes, there is domestic violence in this relationship that exists, to be able to make those orders that are more geared toward protecting the victim and the children going forward. The other issue is that something that often comes up and is incredibly frustrating is that victims are kind of the focus of like, okay, they have been the one that have been victimized. That doesn't mean that the abuser is a bad parent. Like, just because they abused mom doesn't mean that they're a bad parent to the children. And that can be incredibly frustrating, because what can happen in the divorce process or in paternity cases is that the abuser no longer has that direct control over the victim, in the sense that maybe they're not living together. So sometimes they will try to use the children to further manipulate and harass mom. So that is an incredibly frustrating misconception that I think happens a lot in the legal system, is that, oh, well, just because they're an abuser doesn't mean they're a bad parent. It does kind of have those sort of, as we sort of themed it, like the rippling effects out on the children, unfortunately, as they become sort of the pawns in that manipulation. So that is, I guess, kind of my 2 cents, is that, like, I want it to be victim driven, but also that involves informing the victims that if there isn't documentation, it gets that much harder to show to the court that there is abuse here, and you need to take it seriously and adjust your orders based on the abuse that's present. And I just want to say too, just for a plug, because I know we were talking about like the criminal aspects of it too, that, you know, in the legal realm with those victims' rights, those rights vest at the time of victimization. So whether or not a person files charges, pursues law, like reporting to law enforcement, so that, you know, law enforcement is aware and can, you know, refer up to the DA's office for charges. It is like a set of rights that exists for every victim, regardless of what their involvement in is in the criminal justice process. And a lot of those rights are geared toward making sure that they have information about the criminal system, that they understand the process, and that they can have input. And I understand like the bond issues, but sometimes as a victim's attorney, telling them that it's not all or nothing, like no contact is not all or nothing, restraining orders are not all or nothing, so that there is like space for them to still have safety and protection, but still communicate with that abuser, because they have to figure out child exchanges. They have to figure out like doctor's appointments with someone who abused them. Like, that is the unfortunate reality of having children with your abuser, is that very rarely is it going to be that abuser is out of the child's life and, you know, mom and the victim is the only parent going forward. That is very rare to see. So a lot of times, like, getting some exceptions or having that communication be super limited and using apps like Our Family Wizard is something that is often ordered, which monitors all of that communication. It keeps an electronic record of it to try to protect the victim and also hold that abuser accountable, and making sure that, you know, is this always the reality? No, but trying to get them on their best behavior as much as possible. So that is my 2 cents.
All right. Speed round.
Yes.
So sorry.
No, you're fine.
So the last sort of place that we want to ripple out is to, we've been talking about a lot about the victim response and the supports that are out there, but another part of, as Elizabeth had mentioned, is that rehabilitation and that treatment. So what we're hoping for is to prevent this in the future. So I'm going to...
Speed round.
I
I'm Carla. I'm the SAFE program supervisor with Peaceful Solutions, which is technically now Bridge Community Clinic. So SAFE stands for Stopping Abuse for Everyone. So that is the group for people who have perpetrated abusive behaviors against their intimate partner of violence. 99% of our people are court ordered to come to the program, but we do accept people on a voluntary basis. At this point, I'm just going to tell you that's an option. That's a treatment option. At the end of the day, really what it falls down to if I get the opportunity to talk to victims is just like any behavior, it's not going to stop unless he wants to stop it. So the treatment can work as long as he's willing to work it. In terms of kind of the ripple effect, Shannon, do you actually mind going back to that quick power and control ripple you had?
Maybe.
If you can go backwards.
That one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Really quickly on this, in terms of what drives, the domestic violence and what, how do you have it in here? What impacts attitudes and behaviors? Everything that's on this ripple out power and control wheel both impacts people's belief system as well as is impacted by their behaviors. So essentially, in order to help somebody change, if they truly want to change, is holding them accountable, and that's throughout this entire table. What drives domestic violence is pro-abusive belief systems, and which creates this sense of entitlement. These people think they are entitled to control their intimate partners. And if at any point along this continuum of everybody up here, they get the message that they have the right to do that, if people aren't holding them accountable throughout, law enforcement, the legal system, et cetera, that is only going to perpetuate those pro-abusive belief systems and that sense of entitlement even more. You got handouts. If you have any more questions about the SAFE program, just reach out.
Well, and I'd say too, community members holding them accountable too, friends, family members and stuff. I think a lot of times people are just oh, that's a family issue, or oh, I don't know, I don't want to rock the boat. No, if you are not liking the way somebody is talking to somebody else, saying something has a lot of impact.
Good point. Because even culture's up there, and if their culture is perpetuating it, it's going to be really hard on a treatment focus to challenge some of those things. So every part of that power and control wheel, the ripple effect, influences that sense of entitlement, the pro-abusive beliefs, and every part of that needs to help challenge those beliefs in order to truly kind of on a societal level especially change domestic violence.
I have a lot of victims too who are people don't say anything, and that just even doing nothing reinforces that it must be me, they're not really doing something wrong, all these negative things they're telling me must be true. So
yeah.
If you look up, there's the 5 Ds of intervention or bystander intervention or something along those lines. One of them is distract. There's a lot of different things you can do if you don't feel comfortable saying to that person hey, your behavior was really inappropriate. You can distract the situation, to try to diffuse the situation. You can delegate it to somebody else to say look, I'm not really close to this person that I saw behave terribly. But I know someone who is, so I'm going to talk to them to see if they're willing to have a conversation to check them on their behavior. There are other Ds, but those are the 2 that are popping out to me right now because I know that it can be really intimidating if you maybe don't know the person well, you don't know the situation well, to just jump in and say and step in the middle of something, and that could actually make it worse in some situations. So I always recommend there are many ways to intervene and try to make things better for the person who is being victimized in that moment.
No, that was great, and see, you could just moderate that anyway. Well, because one of the things, and again, pulling back to the Wausau Metro Strong and the Chamber's involvement in this, to talk about how this ripples out into workplaces or schools. So one of the things that we always want to talk about is that, again, everyone knows someone. So one of the things that we've been looking at and trying to help with is does your place of employment or the place that you manage have a policy on responding to domestic violence? Because a lot of places don't. You have a sexual harassment policy that's in the manual. But what happens if a victim comes to you with a restraining order and says, this person can't be near me? How are we responding to that? Or how are we responding to someone who's saying, I'm not safe, I don't want to go home? And what kind of accommodations are made for things like court dates or meeting with an advocate, or if someone has to go hide in shelter for a while, right? So really looking into those workplaces responding. So these are, so the Futures Without Violence site actually has a whole resource site about workplaces responding to domestic violence. So again, that rippling out into the community because we know that it's happening. But the other part of it is, so this is from a 2003 analysis, right? So, you know, I don't do math, but do the math for inflation, right? How many days people lose, right? I can't even begin to tell you when someone flees to shelter, if they don't show up for work the next day, that they lose their job. And so that, one, costs that victim their safety and self-sufficiency, but also then costs that workplace because now they're hiring and training and reestablishing employment for someone who's perfectly capable and wonderful at doing their job, just hit a little bump in the road and needs a couple days to recombobulate, right? So talking about those impacts and how workplaces can respond, and also the cost and impact. And again, coming back to why we're here, right? The domestic violence incident that happened in 2017 literally impacted the workplaces of everyone involved, right? That was very specifically targeted violence at the people who tried helping the victim. So to understand that this does occur, that we know it's happening, that we know people are trying to help, and that there's inherent risk in that. So how do we plan accordingly? I think, yeah, okay. So, so if we're all, I'm gonna speak for all of us, right? We're all pretty accessible. So feel free to email. I don't have the police department and the emergency department's contact info because you can find them at the police department and the emergency department respectively. So if you're interested, and I will also apologize, Carla gave me a beautiful handout set all about SAFE, and I think it's sitting on the printer at our office right now. So I can also, it was in a PDF, so I can email it to our partners within Metro Strong and the Chamber and get that emailed out to everyone. Yep, that's exactly where it's sitting right now.